A person traveling past Knoxville or through the Blue Ridge feels ground that seems dead still. But those familiar mountains hide a dense network of shattered, active fault lines buried miles in the rock. Seismometers record that these ancient, unmapped breaks are still slipping today. The Appalachian crust is actively shifting right now beneath roads and towns that look entirely settled. A man driving through eastern Tennessee is not looking for earthquakes. He sees tree lines, sandstone ledges, shale slopes, and old rail beds. Towns sit exactly where the land finally opens up. Houses rest quietly on their lots. The ridges look rounded and finished. This region feels solidly fixed. The land feels like it already finished becoming itself. That surface is lying. The quiet is only skin deep. Deep below the soil and stream gravel, the crust carries immense damage. Millions of years of erosion stripped the top off these mountains, leaving the strongest pieces behind. That weather covered the broken architecture beneath colluvium and younger sediment. Surface mapping misses the scars completely because no giant trench exists in the woods. These mountains were built in intense collisions. Between 480 and 250 million years ago, whole continents slammed together in massive stages. Laurentia, Avalonia, and Gondwana collided and crushed the old Iapetus Ocean out of existence. The crust had nowhere easy to go. It buckled, folded, and stacked exactly like a rug pushed hard across a floor. Thrust faults formed where massive slabs of rock shoved directly over other slabs. Shear zones formed where heavy blocks ground past each other under extreme pressure. This destruction happened repeatedly across tens of millions of years. Newer damage got laid directly over older damage again and again. The collisions left a dense, uneven network of ruined rock. Those ancient fractures never fully healed into solid blocks again. They remain the weak seams in the modern crust. When present-day stress pushes across the region, the rock keeps failing along those exact inherited pathways today. The old damaged zones guide the strain the way a dent in metal guides the next bend. The crust remembers where it broke. Most of these breaks stay completely hidden until the earth moves. That is exactly what happened near Sparta, North Carolina. A person traveling through Sparta sees ordinary mountain ground with winding roads and patches of woods. Nobody ever mapped a fault there because the surface gave no obvious clues. On August 9, 2020, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake hit. It started extremely shallow, roughly 2,000 to 300 feet down. The rupture energy punched right through the earth and tore the surface wide open. A fresh scarp cut through fields, woods, and the Greenway Drive Industrial Park. The ground actually broke, standing up to 25 centimeters high. This was the first documented surface rupture in the eastern United States, putting Sparta in a tiny club. Researchers named it the Little River Fault. The quake exposed a shallow bedrock plain that crossed the main structural grain of the mountains. The region was squeezed by northeast-southwest compression, and this unmapped fault sat at the perfect angle to slip. It had reverse motion mixed with left lateral sliding. It showed that quiet Appalachian bedrock holds hidden structures capable of tearing roads apart. Researchers used laser mapping to strip away surface clutter and radar from space to track ground movement. They trenched the earth to physically view the shallow fault zone. The town had been sitting right over a reactivated older lineament tied to Cenozoic age brittle deformation. The hidden systems go far deeper than shallow bedrock. Around Asheville, the mountains look like heavily worn leftovers. Older models assumed hundreds of millions of years of erosion had completely dismantled the deep roots of the range. The lower crust was supposed to be a blended mess. That standard picture turned out to be wrong. Geologists mapping the Asheville area found something very different. Mineral grains in the rock lined up in ways that preserved the memory of ancient shear zones. Early seismic profiles showed huge, coherent fault blocks still sitting in the lower crust. The old mountain architecture survived far better than anyone expected. These surviving basement fabrics actively guide the modern strain right now. The old skeleton of the mountain belt is still doing work. Some deep pieces of crust kept their identity instead of melting into a reset system. Those cold, lower crustal blocks influence exactly where small earthquakes cluster. The region is not a dead leftover. After the original mountains were built, the supercontinent Pangaea began breaking apart around 200 million years ago. This rifting event introduced stretching forces instead of the old squeeze. This extension did not erase the earlier faults, it merely added another dense layer of change. Some old weaknesses were reworked in completely new directions. The matching structures across the Atlantic prove this mountain belt belonged to a much larger continental assembly. Some researchers track a deep mantle feature called the Northern Appalachian Anomaly beneath the region. This hot zone triggers Rayleigh-Taylor instability. Heavy, dense material is still dripping downward from this mantle blob. This unusual thermal shifting interacts with the strong, older framework of the crust, creating strange seismic signals beyond direct imaging. The mountains sit directly over a stacked archive of active tectonic parts. Men living in the Blue Ridge already knew the ground was restless. Locals tell stories about a spoon trembling in a cup or a cabinet clicking in the early morning. They describe a quick thump from below that makes a single glass tap the shelf. The folklore carried this history long before instruments arrived. Outsiders often dismiss these stories as exaggeration. The hard granitic rock of the Blue Ridge carries vibrations very efficiently. A tiny release of pressure on an ancient fault sends a crisp pulse straight into a house. The hard rock keeps passing that vibration today sharply into local kitchens. These frequent micro-earthquakes happen constantly. The official science simply lagged behind local folklore for decades. People on the slopes built their own memory of the ground shaking while the rest of the country looked the other way. 5 small events over a few years feels like a clear pattern to the people living there. The reason the science lagged is a massive gap in monitoring. California tracks faults with tight networks of permanent instruments spaced 10 to 20 kilometers apart. Across much of the East Coast, the spacing sat at 50 to 100 kilometers. The East Coast became the ugly stepchild of earthquake research. The problem sits strictly in the spacing between the ears, listening for the threat. It earned that name because it did not produce giant, frequent disasters. Less shaking naturally brought less federal funding. Legacy Eastern stations often use older, short-period instruments built for global teleseismic data. Those tools easily clipped off-scale during strong local tremors, ruining the motion history needed for engineering. The gear was simply built for a totally different job. In California, dense arrays let researchers triangulate an epicenter instantly. Eastern stations sit far apart, creating wide azimuthal gaps. If the gap in coverage around a source gets wider than 120 degrees, the mathematical uncertainty grows rapidly. The local network might aim for 5 kilometers at 95% confidence on paper. In the actual field, varying crust causes the location to drift wider than any simple model predicts. Epicenters remain uncertain by a few kilometers, smearing the map over wide areas. That wide station Spacing leaves researchers guessing at exactly which buried fault just moved. The gap makes it much harder to pinpoint shaking under a dam, a bridge, or a town. The true subsurface map stays blurry. The East Tennessee seismic zone remains highly active, yet large gaps in coverage hide the true details. It stands out as one of the busiest earthquake belts outside New Madrid. Small clues constantly slip through the wide net. Hard eastern bedrock carries waves over huge distances, but the near source picture remains thin. The region is listening to its own ground from too far away. That same scattered pattern runs deep into the Appalachian Basin and New York State. Small earthquakes are still happening right now across the basin, aligning with known or strongly inferred lines. People piece these fault lines together from indirect signs like wave arrivals and depth trends. The ground only yields the secret after it moves. The basin stops being just gas fields and folded rock, becoming a corridor of buried hazard. The crust adjusts in other ways too. After the massive ice sheets melted, the land began rising again. Glacial isostatic rebound changes the stress across a broad area. Far-field forces push and pull from the Atlantic Ridge at mere millimeters per year. Rock only needs time to store that strain. GPS data detects crustal shortening aligned perfectly with old northeast-southwest trends. This measurement shows the modern strain is not acting on blank rock. It works directly through the inherited pattern left by the old collisions. Where the old structures and the new strain match directions, the chance of reactivation goes up. The region simply reuses the old plumbing in the rock. The crust in the eastern United States builds that strain slowly. The old broken zones take all that stress in the end. The plate carries low, steady pressure for long periods until a weak spot finally lets go. The quiet surface hides a region full of bridges and plants sitting over this tension. The Ramapo system stretches more than 185 miles, showing the exact same hidden style. Small earthquakes tie into a long buried weakness with unmapped extensions. Parts are known, but parts continue beneath heavy cover where the surface reveals absolutely nothing. The shaking often comes from deeper segments nobody traced clearly. Even after hundreds of millions of years, these old scars affect practical engineering. They shape groundwater flow through the bedrock. They control slope stability along the highways and dictate where certain rocks break more easily. The hidden hazard in a low-strain region is not the mountain tearing itself apart. The hazard is the sheer number of inherited weaknesses waiting to react when stress builds. Out west, the fault and the network sit almost face to face. In much of the East Coast, the fault and the network sit talking across a valley, a county line, or two ridges too many. The exact source fails to get nailed down the way California researchers expect. That specific difference lives entirely in the data, shaping exactly what the region knows about itself. This is why broadband arrays matter so much. A dense network of sensitive instruments catches the tiny tremors and short bursts on deep structures. Clusters begin to show up on the map. Hidden faults finally start taking shape because the ground whispers the same answer repeatedly. The Earth does not hand over a perfect address automatically. Researchers also use magnetotellurics to look into the Earth. By measuring how electrical signals move through the ground helps outline deep features. Different rocks respond differently, revealing structures the eye cannot see. One tool hears the shakes while another outlines the shape. The hidden fault slowly turns into a mapped hazard. The system is slowly getting better. The transportable array boosted data across wide parts of the country after 2004. This moving coverage gave a much richer look at background seismic behavior. More broadband stations and accelerographs were added near critical facilities, but the upgrades still heavily lag the actual need. The disparity lingers, leaving the East with older assumptions and wide gaps. The 2011 Virginia earthquake snapped this reality into view for millions. It cracked the old assumption that older rocks meant a low-stakes seismic backwater. The shaking traveled far from the source, hitting buildings across a massive area. People who never thought about Eastern risk had to think about it fast. That event worked perfectly like a flashlight. It did not create the hidden problem, but it lit the problem up for a moment. It proved the old assumptions were simply too simple. The East gets treated as the quieter side of the country, but quiet is not the same thing as safe. Less frequent is not unimportant. The familiar landscape hides its structural damage incredibly well. The valley roads and quiet hollows give no warning about the fractured blocks buried underneath. A ridgeline at sunset looks perfectly smooth and settled. Under it sit stacked slabs of crust shoved over each other when oceans closed. The weak seams still take the stress right now. The ground beneath the Appalachians continues reacting today along the exact same lines drawn millions of years ago. The mountains look completely quiet from the highway. The instruments say otherwise. The rock remembers exactly where it broke.